Good day. Before I proceed with this program, just to cover some household points. Firstly, just to repeat again that we are now once again doing our live streams on YouTube. You can find them there. We stopped for a short time doing this because of reasons I've discussed in earlier videos, but after some discussion and some reflection, we have resumed doing them again. Secondly, if you're watching our videos on Rumble, where you can find all our channels, Alexander Mercouris, the Duran, and Alex Christoforou, by typing our names into the search bar. If you watch our video on Rumble, if you go up to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press it, that will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you will find that we have a thriving community with lots of members which you can join and in which you can participate, and in addition participate through that way in my live streams, which happen every Wednesday. Further, there's one other point I want to make, which is to apologize for the fact that I didn't publish a video yesterday. Straightforwardly, I was exhausted, as I am sure you will all understand. Trying to stay on top of the news in this incredibly fast-changing situation is demanding, to say the least, and I decided that I would take Saturday not entirely off, because I did a live stream with my colleague Alex Christoforous for the Duran on Saturday morning, but I decided to skip doing a video on Saturday evening. Well, today, as you can see, I am doing a video. So briefly, where are we in this tangled web of a conflict? The first thing to say is that from what I've been able to glean, it's not always easy to get a good insight into the military developments, and as I've explained many times, as a non-military person, I'm not perhaps even or necessarily the best person to analyze them. But it seems to me that the position at the moment is that the Ukrainian army in the eastern Ukraine is indeed now surrounded, that Ukraine's army has lost its capacity for maneuver to the extent that it ever had much, and it also seems that though there's been multiple attempts to create this humanitarian corridor from Mariupol, so far it has not been successfully implemented. Each side blames the other for the attempts to obstruct it. And at the same time, it seems that the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic has been steadily encroaching into the city, and apparently is engaged in heavy fighting with some of the Ukrainian troops there, some of whom do apparently belong to the ultra-right battalions like Azov, which we've been hearing so much about. I have to add that the news about the condition of the civilian population of the city is terrible. There's some reports that there's no water or electricity, and that food supplies are down to 1 to 2 days at most. So an evacuation from the city would seem to be essential for humanitarian reasons. But it seems that because of the fighting, because of possible obstruction, the Russians each side is accusing the other of obstructing the evacuation. Because of the obstruction of the evacuation, at the moment that isn't happening. I'm going to add here my own observation, which is, I suppose, that of a rational and remote observer to these events. Given how desperate the condition of the civilian population has become, given that the position of the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol is untenable, they're completely surrounded and face destruction if they stand and fight. It seems to me that the only proper thing to do in this kind of situation is for the Ukrainian command to do what the various fighters who were fighting President Assad in Syria did, as I discussed in that program, which I did on Friday, which is to negotiate their withdrawal from Mariupol. I'm sure the Russians would agree to that. They could withdraw to Kiev, perhaps, as I suspect, ultimately to Lviv. But one way or the other, they would leave Mariupol, where they're only going to cause extraordinary suffering, not just to themselves, but to the civilian population, by putting on a resistance which seems to me to have no conceivable military logic behind it. I say that, I understand that I'm remote from this conflict. I don't share the passions and emotions of the people in place. And of course, we're talking about the ultra-right battalions. These are people with a particular political philosophy, which perhaps makes it especially difficult for them either to retreat or surrender in the way that I would have thought is logical. I will say no more. I would add, whilst we're talking about the conflict in Ukraine, that there has been a really disastrous amount of fake news, and I use that word advisedly, and some of it has come from most unexpected quarters. Firstly, we had this extraordinary report 2 days ago about the fire and the shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. I found it really concerning that that really very alarming story continued to circulate sometime after its essential facts had been debunked and it was established that there was only a fire in an administrative building following a firefight. Well, that was one example, perhaps not the most major, but the story that has really caused me some dismay was a story that I was reading last night and this morning in the Financial Times, and which was the main headline story in the Financial Times, which is that the United States was in discussion with the Polish government about the Polish government supposedly supplying Soviet-era fighter jets to Ukraine so that they could fight the Russian Air Force. I never found that story at all convincing, and sure enough, a few hours later, the Polish government said it was fake news. I am really concerned that a newspaper like the Financial Times should have allowed itself to be talked into reporting a story like that in the way that it did. I mean, perhaps there were some sort of discussions, but there was never the remotest possibility that Poland would agree to anything like that. And the Poles have categorically ruled out, or so it seems, any involvement of any of their aircraft, either by transferring them to Ukraine or otherwise, or of the use of their territory as a base for military action involving Russia. And that, by the way, might have relevance in light of another story, which, by the way, I don't think is fake news, which has also been circulating over the course of the day. This is a report in the Washington Post, which has now received wide circulation, that the United States is actively considering setting up a Ukrainian government in exile. And apparently, US special forces are standing ready to spring Zelensky from Kiev and to bring him to the West so that he could be the head of this government in exile there. Well, that in itself is certainly possible. I don't consider that a irrational idea. But what has disturbed me and what I've already argued strongly against in the past is this idea, which apparently goes hand in hand with the idea of a government in exile, which is to try to create some kind of insurgency in Ukraine via this government. I have to say that this is a disastrously bad idea. It would spread violence into Central Europe. It would expose countries that hosted these forces, conceivably Poland, Romania, perhaps other countries. It would expose them to potential retaliatory action by the Russians, and of course it would spread violent young men with guns all across the European Union, which, as I said, is something which I find difficult and too alarming altogether to contemplate. Last but not least, I would say that the fact that the Poles don't seem to be keen on the idea of using their airfields and their aircraft to fight Ukraine's war. I wonder whether Poland and Romania and Bulgaria and all those countries would agree to host or act as a base area for such an insurgency. Anyway, that's where we are on this. Meanwhile, there's been an enormous amount of diplomatic activity. Prime Minister Bennett of Israel has visited Moscow, where he's had talks with President Putin. Israel seems to be trying to position itself as some sort of a mediator. President Erdogan of Turkey has telephoned President Putin and has also again offered Turkey's position as a mediator. President Macron of France has also called President Putin of Russia. Apparently they spoke for 1 hour and 40 minutes. All three of these people, Macron, Bennett and Erdogan, found Putin in an implacable mood. And apparently he's telling people in Russia it's very difficult at the moment to get full accounts of what Putin is saying because so much access to Russian sites is restricted. In the meantime, he's telling Russians that the situation, the condition of Ukraine's military has now been degraded beyond retrieval, and that part of the operation is very close to being completed. It is the cleansing of Ukraine of the far-right movement and of its ideology that now remains the issue. And it seems that the Russians are still looking forward to negotiating some kind of deal or compromise with Zelensky's government in exactly the way that I discussed in my last program. I would add that in terms of that negotiation, there was a rather disturbing development. It seems that one of the people who turned up with the first Ukrainian delegation to meet with the Russians in Belarus, this is about a week ago, that particular person, a former banker, has been killed. There is considerable argument about why he was killed and who killed him. There's one story reported in the Ukrainian media that he was killed by the Ukrainian security service, the SBU, because he was found to be in covert contact with the Russians and was seen as a traitor. Supposedly he was in the process of being arrested, but apparently resisted arrest and got shot whilst resisting arrest and was shot dead. There is another report from an entirely different official Ukrainian agency which says that on the contrary, this person was actually a Ukrainian intelligence agent and he was killed in the line of duty. He died heroically in the line of duty, though it's not explained how or in what kind of a way. I have to say I find this whole story extremely disturbing. What this person, who apparently was not part of the official formal Ukrainian delegation, was doing when they met with the Russians in Belarus is completely unclear, and the circumstances of his death are unclear also. but it does perhaps illustrate that there's an awful lot on in Ukraine, which is difficult to decipher and difficult to understand. And one way or the other, this particular episode does not give a very encouraging view of developments within the Ukrainian government itself in Kiev. So that's all I'm going to say about those things. Perhaps the most interesting discussion in a diplomatic format that took place over the weekend was a conversation between the US and Chinese foreign ministers, Wang Yi and Tony Blinken. Now, this discussion, which took place on March 5th, happened, as the Chinese are careful to say, at the US request. And it's a very interesting conversation. I'm going to read the readout, and at least the part of the readout which concerns Ukraine, which is obviously what the main part of the discussion was all about, because what it strongly suggests is that the Chinese are having second doubts about offering themselves as mediators. And as I will explain in a moment, there is in fact a corresponding article in Global Times which says the same thing. Anyway, this is what the article says, what the Chinese readout of the conversation says. Blinken briefed Wang Yi on the US views and position on the current situation in Ukraine. Wang Yi said the evolution of the situation in Ukraine up to now is not something China wants to see. The Ukraine issue is complicated, which not only concerns the basic norms governing international relations, but also is closely related to the security interests of various parties. Efforts should focus not only solving the current crisis, but also maintaining long-term peace and stability in the region. Note those words, maintaining long-term peace and stability in the region. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China always decides its position and policy based on the merits of the matter itself. China believes that the Ukraine crisis should be resolved in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. First, respect and safeguard all countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity. Second, stay committed to peacefully resolving disputes through dialogue. We hope that the war will stop as soon as possible, the situation on the ground will be eased, the life and property safety of civilians will be effectively guaranteed, and a large-scale humanitarian crisis will be prevented. And then we come to the most interesting part of the readout. Wang Yi pointed out the Ukraine crisis can only be solved through dialogue and negotiations. China supports every effort conducive to easing the security situation and seeking political settlement. China opposes any moves that fan the flame, add fuel to the flame, and escalate the tensions rather than promote a diplomatic solution. China will continue to speak out and do its best for peace. We encourage direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Though talks may not go smoothly, the international community should continue to render collaboration and support until results and peace are achieved. We also encourage the United States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the European Union to engage in equal-footed dialogue with Russia, face up to the frictions and problems accumulated over the years, pay attention to the negative impact of NATO's continued eastward expansion on Russia's security, and seek to build a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security mechanism in accordance with the principle of indivisible security. So all the last, of course, are Russian talking points. The Chinese say, in polite words, Yes, we do support territorial integrity of countries. Yes, we do want to see a peaceful resolution to this conflict. But ultimately, the blame for this crisis rests upon you. It is you, Americans, and the Western powers who have created this crisis by not recognizing Russia's legitimate security concerns, by expanding NATO eastward. And that what you need to do is to stop sanctioning Russia and instead negotiate with the Russians in good faith in a way that addresses their legitimate security concerns. Now that's what Yang Yi's was said to Blinken, but we've got further clarification of what this all means in an article in Global Times. And Global Times makes it very clear that what the West appears to be trying to do is that they appear to be trying to push the Chinese into not so much acting as a mediator in this conflict, but rather involve themselves in diplomacy in a way that will make the Chinese essentially exert pressure on the Russians to settle this conflict on Western terms. And that's something the Chinese are emphatically not willing to do, and it's cooled them on the whole idea of becoming mediators. And this is what the article says. And it's an article, as I said, in Global Times. And this is what the article says. Blinken is clearly not asking for peace mediation, but is pressuring China to follow the US to sanction Russia. And his words are trying to beautify and justify the US-led sanctions against Russia. But in fact, there is no precedent that proves that Western sanctions could effectively mediate any conflict. And then the article quotes Liu Xiang, a research fellow at the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, as saying the following. Blinken's claim that the world is acting in unison to follow the US to make Russia pay a high price is far from the truth, because many major countries, including major powers like China, South Africa, and India, are keeping neutral. And these countries are making decisions independently on the issue. Many are feeling reluctant to maximize the sanctions at all costs, and many who follow the sanctions are to an extent being forced by the political correctness imposed by the US. And then the article goes on to say that the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, said that China should mediate future talks between Russia and Ukraine, as Western powers cannot fulfill that role. The US and EU are the parties directly involved in the Ukraine issue, while China is a party being concerned but not directly involved. So they have different positions on promoting peace talks. China does not, and then the article goes on to say, if they truly want China to be the mediator, the promise is that they should immediately stop stirring up trouble that would escalate tensions. China and Russia, as well as Ukraine, are victims of US hegemonic strategy, and China is facing similar pressures and threats in the Asia-Pacific region, like what Russia is dealing with in Europe, and asking how could the US expect a victim to convince another victim to tolerate its bullying. So essentially, the Chinese, having at one point looked as if they might be willing to act as mediators, are cooling on the idea because they're worried that if they do start to fulfill that role, what it will do is open the door for the United States and the Europeans to pressure them into imposing sanctions upon Russia or supporting US and Western sanctions upon Russia, which the Chinese have no intention of doing. So it's clear, therefore, that the US, Blinken, Borrell have come up against a blank wall where China is concerned. And that may be what is now leading to some talk from people like Blinken about going further still with the sanctions against Russia, the US sanctions against Russia, by trying to coordinate a Western embargo on Russian oil imports. Now, I'm going to say straight away that it's quite clear to me that last weekend a line was crossed, a fatal line was crossed, when the Western powers took the, I suspect, ultimately disastrous decision, that the decision that will be seen to have been ultimately disastrous, of sanctioning the Russian central bank. What they found is that they set a chain reaction, because by taking a step like that, they have in effect created shock right across the entire world economic system, because all the various players, all the various actors operating in the world economy, the various big Western companies, all of those sort of people are now saying to themselves, if the Western powers were prepared to take this extraordinary step of sanctioning a central bank, a G20 central bank, of freezing the capital reserves, the foreign currency reserves of a G20 central bank, of ignoring the principle of sovereign immunity that attaches to central bank funds on this kind of scale, then there is literally nothing that they will not do. And that has led to a general freeze right across the world in trade in commodities, specifically, of course, Russian commodities, but it is having a ripple effect throughout the world economy. And we're starting to see more and more moves like this. We saw a move today by Visa and MasterCard, for example, to restrict their operations with respect to Russia. Now, I want to here perhaps clarify a misunderstanding. Russian Visa and MasterCards issued by Russian banks can still operate within Russia itself. They cannot operate abroad, they cannot operate outside Russia, and Visa and MasterCards issued by Western banks cannot operate in Russia, and nor can they operate if they are issued even by Russian corresponding banks outside Russia. So Russian issued Visa and MasterCards can continue to operate in Russia, provided they've been issued in Russia itself. Its banks, its Visa and MasterCard issued by foreign banks that cannot operate in Russia, and by Russian banks that that have issued these cards outside Russia. And those cards also, the Russian cards, cannot operate outside Russia either. So it's in effect restricting the operation of Visa and MasterCards issued by Russian domestic banks to Russia itself. It's a curious move. There are all kinds of legal reasons why it's working out like this. What it is doing, apparently, is it is causing Russian banks, which have obviously been preparing for this for some time, to roll out more of the domestic Mir cards to their customers, and also to connect that card to China's enormous Union Pay system, which, by the way, is much bigger than either Visa or MasterCard. But What is perhaps more important than that particular incident is what we're now seeing happen across the entire world trading system. And here I'm going to take this from an article by Liam Halligan in the Daily Telegraph. Before I read parts of this article, I'm not going to read it all because it's behind a paywall. I ought to say in passing that I have actually met Liam Halligan many years ago in the past. We don't know each other, we're not friends, and I doubt that he remembers the meeting. But we did meet socially on one occasion. I, for the record, think that he's a very fine economic commentator and writer. Anyway, this is what Liam Halligan has to say in this article in the Daily Telegraph. The war in Ukraine is a catastrophe for the global economy, the World Bank president observed last week. It comes at a bad time for the world because inflation was already rising, said David Malpass, a former US Treasury Minister who has headed the Washington-based institution since 2019. Malpass is right. Both US and UK inflation was already at a 30-year high. Now, Russia's military incursion into Ukraine has sparked full-on economic war between Russia and the West. These two conflicts combined, in my view, that's Liam Halligan's view, will push inflation deep into double digits on both sides of the Atlantic. Brent crude touched $122 earlier this week, up from around $70 in December, with European natural gas hitting an all-time high as fears swirled about the continuity of Russia's vast energy exports. Something, by the way, which Blinken's wild comments about acting against Russia's energy exports isn't going to help. Higher crude costs and profiteering by unscrupulous retailers mean that motorists could soon face £2 sterling per litre petrol and diesel, almost 40% up since the start of this year. Household utility bills are already set to average almost £2,000 sterling per annum from April, and as the Ofgem energy price cap is raised. I would add in parenthesis that in April, my household utility bills are rising by 54%. I live in Britain. That average could now, based on post-invasion wholesale energy costs, hit almost £3,000 sterling this autumn. Prior to this conflict, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, outlined a package of measures to support cash-strapped households with their utility bills. He will now surely need to do more. Countless UK companies similarly face spiralling fuel costs, but with no price cap protection. Many of them energy-intensive manufacturers in northern working class constituencies across the Midlands and north of England, seats which switched to the Conservatives in 2019. As electricity prices escalate, such companies, often significant local employers, could easily be wiped out. Again, with the government's House of Commons majority contingent on retaining working class support, Sunak has little choice but to act. But the inflation impact of this war goes way beyond energy. The S&P GSCI index, tracking a wide range of commodity and raw material prices, surged 16% over the last week alone. Russia and Ukraine between them account for a third of global wheat and barley exports and a fifth of all maize, most of it shipped through Ukrainian ports such as Kherson and Odessa, cities now mired in conflict. Even if civilian container ships could physically access these ports, which they currently can't, they would anyway now be part of an astonishing ban imposed by last week by leading sea freight companies. Maersk of Denmark, Singapore's Ocean Network Express, Swiss-based MSC, Germany's Hapag-Lloyd, and CMA of France, 5 of the world's 6 biggest cargo shipping lines, all announced their refusal to shift containers with goods originating from or bound for Russia as the world ramped up sanctions. The other member of the big 6 sea freight lines, COSCO of China, has also suspended service from Ukraine on safety grounds. Over the last week, much has been made of Western companies announcing they have suspended services. They will wind down their Russian interests. With almost 150 million consumers and an unmatched natural resource endowment, Russia has attracted serious foreign investment since the Soviet Union collapsed. BP owns a fifth of Russia's largest oil company, Rosneft. Shell co-financed Nord Stream 2 and has a massive stake in the Sakhalin oil and gas complex in Russia's Far East. Industrial thoroughbreds such as Ford, Boeing, Volkswagen, and Siemens have extensive Russian operations. Media and tech giants like Warner Brothers, Disney, and Sony, Apple, and Dell have also forged deep Russian links. All these Russian companies have suspended their Russian operations or pledged to sell off stakes and shouted loudly about doing so given the reputational damage. Yet I'd say the little noticed freight shipping moratorium is of far more economic consequence, given the huge amount of bulk commodities Russia supplies to the world, not just food, but industrial metals like titanium, palladium, copper, and nickel, vital for car making, semiconductor manufacture, and other industrial processes. The shipping giants are like commercial red blood corpuscles carrying the oxygen equivalent goods that allow vital organs of the global economy. I would add there's other products as well. Neon gas, for example, of which Russia and Ukraine are also vital producers, is an indispensable part of an indispensable product needed for semiconductor manufacture. And then it goes on to say the inability of Western firms to ship consumer goods to Russia will hurt, depriving them of what has become one of the world's most lucrative markets. Of far more significance will be the inflation generated by the lack of commodity raw material exports from Russia, not just energy, but food and metals. Consider that fertilizer is made by using natural gas and potash, with Russia and its ally Belarus accounting for 2/5 of the world's potash exports. This explains why fertilizer prices are soaring across the Western world, and the resulting rise in cultivation costs will inevitably drive food prices up too. So there's much more to read, but the essential point is this: we are working ourselves into an inflation shock. Inflation shock of a like we haven't seen since the 1970s, perhaps worse. And what makes it so extraordinary is that it's self-inflicted, and it comes on the back of a previous inflation shock, which I've discussed in many programs. The inflation shock caused by the unconstrained financing of the US economy by the Biden administration as soon as it took office last year, as it sought to turbocharge the US economy in an effort to try to overtake China. Now, I have to say, looking at all of this, I do ask myself again whether all of this has been properly thought through. It seems to me that what happened is that either there was an agenda by some people who don't understand economics to hit Russia hard by cutting off its raw material exports. something which will hit Russia hard, but which I think Russia could still ride out, because after all, this is an issue that concerns them. And again, I think people overestimate the importance of foreign exporting to the Russian economy. But that's another story. I'm not going to discuss it today. But I think it's overlooking the scale of the inflation shock that is being inflicted on the Western economies. So I wonder whether, if it was really planned, it was planned all along, whether the people who planned it, perhaps in the State Department and in certain think tanks like the Atlantic Council, really consulted the technical specialists, the economic advisors properly, and thought through what they were doing. Or if, which is equally possible, if the Western powers rushed into this decision, this disastrous decision to sanction the Russian central bank, which, as I said, is what has caused this cascade effect across the world economy, whether they did that in a fit of emotion without thinking it through, well, the effect one way or the other is the same. I understand that the Federal Reserve Board in the United States has now made very clear in communications that it circulated across the finance industry in the United States that it was not consulted in advance about the decisions to sanction the central bank, or indeed to disconnect certain Russian banks from SWIFT. So that, if that is true, then that suggests to me that the Federal Reserve Board is already preparing the ground for whatever defense it has to make of its decisions when we face the full consequences of what's been done, probably sometime in the summer and autumn. Anyway, logically, again, in a rational world, what ought to happen is that the Western powers ought to be doing everything they can to try to facilitate some kind of political resolution of this crisis, so that they can start to row back some of these sanctions and start to restore some semblance of normality to world trade. With emotion apparently taking over from reason, with all kinds of visceral feelings having taken possession, it doesn't seem as if that's happening. And that's why we seem to be working ourselves up in the West to doing ever more extreme and dangerous and reckless things, like cutting ourselves off from Russian oil and trying to pressure the Chinese to sanction the Russians for us, presumably all this trying to sort of force the Russians to change policy in order to get ourselves off the hook that we're landing ourselves on, and which, had we handled this matter better, we should never have found ourselves on in the first place. Anyway, we will see how things turn out. That's enough from me today. More from me soon. Remind you all again, you can find us on Rumble and Locals, and also on other platforms. You can find links under this video. You can support us via PayPal, via Patreon, sorry, not PayPal, Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the things that we have there. And last but not least, please remember to check your subscription to this channel, and please press the like button if you like this video. Thank you again, and more from me soon.